In Fire Emblem Fates, there is a reputation that the Revelation path is, well, rather tedious and unenjoyable. This is due to many maps being the subject of considerable criticism, which is understandable. I don't think there's a single Fire Emblem game entirely immune to having the bad map every once in a while. Among these bad maps in Rev, there are a few specifically that often come to mind at the mention of Rev. One of these is Chapter 10, Voice of a God, or as is far more commonly known, the Snow Shoveling map. For the context of said map, I don't plan on going over the story, but as a brief synopsis, the Norian mage Zula has the place frozen over with his magic to impede Corrin's army. I'm not here to talk about Fate's story, though. I think this map, contrary to public opinion, is in fact not terrible, but instead honestly a good map. I don't think it's the best map out there by any means, but I'd rather play it over many other maps, and by a relatively large margin as well. So now that I've dropped a take hot enough to melt an entire map full of snow, what is it that makes this map so great? Well, first off, I think we should try looking at the argument for why people don't like it. The map's critics generally cite the tedium of the map as its problem, which can be a fair assessment, especially if you're playing this only for the first time, which I'd imagine is probably an overwhelming majority of the critics, as they're generally the sort that wouldn't replay Rev even if you paid them to. However, when you get a better understanding of the layout and mechanics, you may find some merit to this idea and will subconsciously play this map better anyway as a result of being more familiar with it. For starters, I think we should look at it from the point of view that this map is, in fact, a variation of Fog of War maps from back in the GBA and Tellius days. However, unlike the old school Fog of War maps, you have all the control you could ever want here. Enemies can't move since they're stuck in the ice, so unlike in a Fog of War, no worrying about some random scary enemy just outright mauling your dancer to death out of nowhere right at the end. There's no tricks or traps. Well, there is, but we'll get to that later, and it's only in a very specific part of the map. If you're feeling bold and want to steam through, you can just go and shave some more ice off with your ranged weapons. Want to play a bit more cautious? You can just slice off a small chunk of ice. This feeds into my next point. Some players would argue not being encouraged or incentivized to move as fast as possible, or some sort of anti-turning mechanic, makes it a bad map. However, like I said, this style of Fog of War map actually would end up giving you better, not worse, control of progress. Sure, a traditional Fog of War may allow units to charge right on in, but if you kept enemies of the same strength, the same stats, it would just be infuriating since the enemies would just very quickly make your army drop like flies. You can still play pretty non-turtily and keep advancing at a decent pace. However, the context of this map's placement I think should also be considered. This map comes right after the notorious Fuga's Wild Ride map, where wind blows everywhere and often forces your units to go where they don't want to go, into downright suicidal areas of the map, if you're not playing or planning ahead for that. While the map will still pump out reinforcements to further agitate the matter. That map does not need reinforcements. I don't care what anyone says. It doesn't. This overall leads to a rather unpleasant time. The idea of the subsequent map is also to give the player a nice break this time around before the more stressful map. This is rather common in Fire Emblem games to put a hard map, then an easy one, then another hard one. Though, I don't necessarily know if in this case I would say the next map is really hard. It can be, if you're not careful, but that's kind of besides the point. Rev is no different here. This is the perfect counter to the previous map, where it felt like a lot of things were out of your control. Everything here in Azumo is under your control. I have heard another, albeit much less common, criticism be that the unit deployment limit is rather small. I can understand this gripe more honestly, as I do think it is somewhat stingy at first. The enemies here are ever so slightly a higher level than the previous map, however, by this point your Corrin and probably Kaze and Felicia or Jacob are likely barely gaining any XP from killing the enemies. This map is very much designed around training up units that you haven't had much chance to grind yet, such as Tsubaki, Mozu, Hana, or even your newly recruited Hayato, who works very well here by the way, and can be a lifesaver in the upcoming chapters. The structure and design of this map heavily incentivizes actually feeding kills to weaker units, since on a map like this, you'll want to keep your units relatively close together. Spreading your units out is gonna get someone killed, most likely. I also found this is a good map to reclass Corrin on. A lot of reclasses start you back with E rank in a different weapon, so you might want to go and train up your weapon rank here. This stuff is great for weapon rank grinding. Generally, at least with my slightly more aggressive approach, you may find as many as 2 or 3 enemies with breaking ice in a turn. This may seem a little bit scary, but you usually do have the tools to make it safe to enemy phase anyway. Due to the nature of your limited manpower, everyone will see plenty of action, even if you say you have a Tsubaki that doesn't have much strength. You can still chip and or tank. Sakura might not be promoted and be able to fight, but she will definitely be busy healing, should you choose to deploy her as a healer. Not to mention her personal skill that negates 2 damage on nearby allies. Very useful in general, but even more so on this map. Those are just some examples. You will notice in my footage I generally like to chip the ice further out with my range attackers, Kaze and Hayato, then depending on what's under the ice, clean up with Corrin and Tsubaki, or even Sing with Azura to move the ranged unit again with a dual strike or something. This somewhat faster and more aggressive play also fixes the earlier problem with the map's tedium. Like, you can't complain about the map's tedium. You're moving too slowly. If this map is boring you, then you're moving too slowly. Like, I mean, it can be as boring or as scary and exciting as possible just based on your choice to play this map. It's literally up to you. So, you know, if you're finding yourself not being challenged, then challenge yourself further. If you're running into a few tough patches where you have to come up with a way to combat 3 or even in some rare cases 4 enemies with your squad, it's far more tense than just chipping ice. It is a legitimate challenge now, and in my honest opinion, a fun one. Lastly, I want to address something some of you may have realized I haven't mentioned at all yet, and that is this. Even if per se you find none of my other arguments convincing of why you shouldn't just skip to Zola and destroy him, there are a ton of great items to be collected to make this map more than worth your time to scour. To start off with, while you find the typical random droppable junk you'd expect on any map, like some iron weapons, some staves, there's some legitimate prizes that make shoveling all that snow very profitable, including an energy drop, a Draco shield, speed wings, a secret book, an angelic robe, a spirit dust, a goddess icon, and a talisman. All right here on the same map, you know, just a few chapters into the game. So literally every stat boost except the boots. Oh, and if that weren't enough, how about a droppable Mjolnir that your Hayato will very likely be able to use soon after you're training him? It functions like a killer weapon, which can be a godsend against berserkers coming up soon. I will be fully honest though, that enemy that's holding the Mjolnir is probably the biggest criticism I personally have on this map. It is absolutely unforgiving to blind players, even to non-blind players. His placement near another few enemies, I think another one is a mage and then another one is a cav with like a javelin or something. It is very cruel. I don't know who thought that was a good idea. It makes that cluster by far the scariest part of the map. It is by far the most dangerous cluster in the map. It's just very scary. I cannot defend the squad. You just have to dispatch them very carefully, I'm afraid. The Mjolnir Mage itself can easily get a 4 times damage crit and kill just about any unit of yours at this point. I think the only one he can't directly kill is maybe like Kaze if he gets a rally res or something. But Corrin pretty much is dead due to a crit. Just about anyone is, really. So you gotta be very careful with him. You gotta be very careful with that Mjolnir Mage. What I would do to fix this, if I were given a rebalance, if I knew how to hack fates or something like that, what I would do is I would swap the Mjolnir with the Nosferatu that Zola has. And the reason being is Zola isn't in the ice. You can see him at the very beginning of the map, and he never moves. So he's stuck in place. You know, he has this scary tome, but he can't move. He can't jump scare you. No cheap Mjolnir jump scare. He's just over in the corner. It is scary, but you know, you can set up for him. He doesn't move, so it's all good, right? And Nosferatu is kind of annoying, but it's kind of hard to really, especially they put a lot of restrictions on Nosferatu and Fates. It can't double, it can't crit. I don't believe it can proc skills, so it's strong, but it's not broken. So that's what I would do personally. Back to the other items. Let's not forget you can claim a Master Seal in a game where money is rather tight if you aren't grinding, and Master Seals aren't super common to find outside of shops. And perhaps even rarer, you can get an arm scroll, which even if you do decide to grind for one, is definitely more on the expensive side. There's even obtainable gold here, I believe it's about 5,000. And I think it's the last amount of gold you'll get for a while in Rev if you're not grinding or doing DLC or something like that. All of these amazing items make this map more than worth your time, I assure you. So don't skip the enemies. Many yield some sort of item, and a decent chunk of them yield very nice ones at that. That all being said, I hope I've given some of you out there another look at this map, and hopefully at least reconsidering your stance on this previously despised map. I understand that undeniably if you see this map as a chore, you'll surely dread it. So hopefully, even if you can't bring yourself to have a more fun challenge with pacing your ice breaking, you can at least look at this chapter as a way to stock up on valuables for later. The crazy thing is that this video I've had an idea for literally years, and I even wrote a script for it. I just changed it up somewhat just now when I made this video, and yeah, I've literally had this for years. But that'll be all for now. I'll see you guys next time.